Madison sat at the piano in her small apartment, struggling to find inspiration for her new composition. The sound of a doorbell interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find an envelope with no return address or stamp. Inside was a letter written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. Dear Miss Madison, we offer you a unique opportunity to complete the unfinished works of the legendary Hugh Barlow, whose pieces remain in the abandoned music school, closed after horrific events. We are confident that only you can bring them to life. We await your arrival soon. Address enclosed. Madison didn't know how to react to this strange proposition. Hugh Barlow's name was known in niche musical circles. A legendary conductor with a dark history, his music evoked both awe and terror. The music school where he worked was closed after a brutal massacre. Official details were scarce, but rumors spoke of a night of unbearable cruelty and madness. Curiosity got the better of her. A few days later, Madison stood before a massive, gloomy building that loomed over her like a menacing monument to the past. The front door was half open, as if the school itself had been waiting for her arrival. Inside, silence reigned, heavy with dust and neglect. Empty corridors seemed to whisper old secrets and unfulfilled dreams. There was something unnatural about the place, but Madison couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. She found the room where Barlow was rumored to have kept his final manuscripts. A pile of scores lay on the floor inside an old wooden crate, covered in a thin layer of dust. Madison felt that by touching these pages, she was connecting with something far greater than just music. The abandoned music school, cold and dark, seemed to hold its breath as Madison touched the keys of an old grand piano left in the corner. It looked like it had witnessed countless rehearsals, concerts, and tragedies. The first melody she played was both familiar and eerie, as if it had come from the deepest corners of her subconscious. The echoes of the sound traveled through the empty corridors, filling them with a haunting harmony. With each chord, the school seemed to awaken. Invisible shadows stirred within its walls, disturbed after decades of silence. Madison couldn't stop. She played deeper and stronger, diving into the melody that seemed to pull her into the abyss of madness. Time lost all meaning, and the dark sky outside the window had turned almost black, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning. When she finally stood up to take a break, she was surrounded by thick darkness. But she was not alone. That night, eerie music began to play in the empty classrooms, lifeless and unnatural. It sounded like someone was playing old instruments, but they lacked both skill and life. Madison listened, and her heart clenched with fear. These sounds were not just music, they were screams, pain, and despair. Trying to locate the source, she ventured into the corridor, but the further she went, the louder the music grew. It seemed to emanate from everywhere, penetrating her consciousness and making her head spin. At the end of the corridor, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned with a terrifying glow. Madison froze. The shadows shifted, and the music in her head became unbearable. She turned and ran back to the piano, but when she glanced back, she realized she was alone. But the fear, the chill in the air, made it clear that the school was alive and would not let her leave until she had heard every note to the end. The school was filled with a crushing silence, occasionally broken by a melody emanating from around a corner or a dark classroom. Madison sat back at the piano, trying to ignore the chill crawling down her spine, and began to play another tune. Suddenly, something changed. The melody started to play on its own, without her touch. The piano came to life, and notes burst from the keys, as if the music itself demanded to be heard. Suddenly, she noticed shadows gliding along the walls, blurred and shapeless. They gathered around her, and one took the form of a woman with a cello, another of a man with a flute. Ghostly musicians, they seemed to play their parts, but the music they produced was not merely instrumental, it was the groans of pain, screams, and whispers of despair, drowning in an enchanting chaos. The shadows came alive. The figures seemed weightless, transparent, but their presence pressed on Madison's psyche, causing an overwhelming sense of dread. One of the ghosts moved closer to her. Its hands, disfigured and translucent, picked up a violin. It played a single note, a sharp, grating sound that pierced the air, leaving a mark on her mind. She realized that these were not just ghosts. They were souls, trapped in an eternal concert of their suffering. Their performance was agony, and the music was punishment. Madison closed her eyes, trying to escape the horrifying sight, but the sounds only grew louder. The musicians now surrounded her, their faces lifeless and twisted in pain, eyes full of despair, and hands that continued to play. She heard their whispers as if they were begging her for help, or perhaps blaming her for their fate. The shadows did not disappear. They were with her every moment, and each chord was a cry from the heart of darkness. But strangely, Madison couldn't stop either. As if she had become part of the orchestra, she reflexively continued playing the piano, trying to finish the remaining compositions. Madison found herself surrounded by chaotic visions. Each completed melody unleashed scenes from that night of the massacre, images that made her blood run cold. No sooner had she finished one part than she saw before her, as if through a fog, musicians collapsing to the ground, their faces twisted in horror and hands trembling with fear. She had become part of this dreadful spectacle, unable to tear herself away from the visions. In one such scene, she saw the conductor, unmistakable in his demeanor, commanding his musicians with chilling coldness. There was nothing but emptiness and madness in his gaze. He gestured toward a cellist, who, as if hypnotized, began to play faster and faster until the strings of her instrument snapped and her throat tore from screaming. Chaos reigned around them, people fell, their instruments shattered, and the sounds of music turned into mad cries. Madison felt the music digging into her mind, filling it with gruesome images and fragments of other people's suffering. With each completed piece, her condition worsened, and she saw more and more bloody marks on the pages of the sheet music, as if they had been written in someone's final moments. The notes transformed into pools of blood, and her own hands shook like those whose agony she felt. She knew that with each played chord, her bond with this place grew stronger, and something dark and sinister took root in her soul. Madison knew that these melodies were not just music, they were the voices of the dead, and each new melody filled them with suffering. She wanted to stop, but the shadows wouldn't leave her alone, forcing her to continue playing. It was clear now, Barlow had captured the deaths of his musicians in the notes, and Madison was unknowingly bringing this nightmare back to life again and again. Each time, bloodier visions pulled her deeper, turning the music into an endless symphony of horror from which there was no escape. She felt her own soul becoming part of this sinister legacy, trapped in the score she could no longer abandon. Madison's fingers trembled as she flipped through another score. The edges of the old pages were stained with something dark and sticky, resembling dried blood. The stains looked as if they had been left in a moment of someone's agony. Every stroke was steeped in pain, as if death itself had been written between the lines. Her hand froze on a page where large drops of blood had replaced the ink, turning the notes into a terrifying message. As she began to play, the music didn't just sound, it conjured oppressive images from which there was no escape. Right before her eyes appeared a hall full of musicians surrounded by thick fog. They played, despite snapped strings and broken bows, and the music sounded like death throes. Madison saw blood running down the hands of a violinist, the violin vibrating from tension, each chord tearing from it like a cry for help. With each new measure, Madison sank deeper into madness, losing her grip on reality. She no longer simply saw the past, she lived in it. The musicians in her visions were faceless figures, but their features became clearer each day. She recognized their faces, saw their fear and despair, as if she were reliving every moment of the massacre. One of the ghosts leaned close to her ear and whispered, "You are our new conductor. Finish the melody." Madison recoiled from the piano, but the shadows continued to follow her, whispering something indistinct yet terrifyingly familiar. She was losing herself, her thoughts consumed by someone else's pain. Each day the visions grew more real. She could smell the blood, hear the last breaths of the musicians, and see them trying to play even when their bodies were already dead. The notes on the pages were no longer music, they were coded deaths, and every performance drew Madison deeper into this nightmare. After spending so much time in the school, Madison stopped going home at night, spending all her time in the abandoned school. One night, during a brief pause for sleep, Madison awoke to the sound of a distant, dying chord from the piano. She rose and saw that the entire school corridor was flooded with mist that slowly climbed to the ceiling, shrouding everything in a sinister veil. The ghosts of the musicians swirled within it, as if caught in some unknown ritual. They whispered in her ear, their voices disjointed but filled with pain and reproach. "You must play until we find peace," one of them whispered. At some point, she found herself in the main hall. The ghosts of musicians filled the space, their shadows twisting and bending in a painful dance. They moved as if trying to relive their final moments. Madison watched in horror as one of the musicians, resembling a young violinist, played so desperately that the strings of his instrument snapped, as if his heart had burst in that instant. He continued to play even as his fingers bled down to the bone. The hall echoed with a ghostly chorus as all the musicians who had died that night now replayed their deaths in an endless loop. The dance of shadows was not just terrifying, it was a sinister ritual where every step measured life and death. The shadows surrounded Madison, weaving her into the whirlwind of pain and madness. One of the specters yanked her arm, and she felt a sharp, cold pain as if her skin were tearing under the icy touch. Madison tried to run, but the shadows kept reaching for her, refusing to let her be, dragging her back to the instrument over and over again. In despair, she wanted to scream, but instead, a melodic yet horrifically distorted sound escaped her throat, as if the voice was not her own. She felt her body turning into a puppet controlled by someone else's will. Her mind screamed for help, but the ghosts would not relent. They wanted their grim symphony finished, and now they would not leave her alone. Before she realized it, Madison was seated at the piano again, her hands trembling but her fingers obediently pressing the keys, producing agonizing chords. The sounds filled the school, growing louder and louder until they turned into thudding beats, like a heart pounding in agony. Madison tried to stop, but her hands no longer obeyed. It was as if an invisible force controlled her every movement, compelling her to play without pause. The music was like a chain, tightening its grip with every chord, dragging her deeper into the abyss. Suddenly, she felt the past come alive around her once more. The thick, acrid scent of blood filled her nostrils, and her eyes welled up with tears of pain and terror. In an instant, she found herself in the same hall where the massacre had once taken place. The musicians were at their posts, but their faces were twisted with fear, their eyes bulging like those of cornered victims. Madison realized she was not just seeing them, she was feeling their fear, their panic. In the center stood the conductor, his figure looming over the orchestra like a grim silhouette of death. His face was hidden in shadow, but his hands moved with precise, confident motions, controlling the musicians like puppets. Suddenly, Madison understood that these movements mirrored her own hands. She was no longer free, she had become part of this nightmare, one of those doomed to play forever in the bloody symphony. The conductor raised his hand, and in that moment, Madison felt her heart seize. She tried to scream, but only the same distorted notes she played emerged from her throat. Her body was no longer hers, it followed the conductor's every motion like an obedient doll. Madison felt the music tearing the last remnants of her will from her, pulling her deeper into madness. Her fingers moved so fast that her skin began to crack and bleed, but the pain no longer mattered. She was trapped in this endless concert of insanity, controlled by the ghost who craved her soul. Exhausted and drained from the ceaseless playing, Madison collapsed to the floor, but her gaze fell upon one more score, the unfinished symphony she had been too afraid to touch. Her heart pounded, as if warning her, but the shadows around her seemed to push her back toward the piano. Her fingers clutched the yellowed pages, and Madison felt waves of strange cold envelop her mind. The final symphony was not just music, it held a power, dark and searing. The notes were written chaotically, as if in a panic, as if someone had tried to capture the last moments of their life. As Madison began to play, her fingers moved slowly, and each sound filled her with a terrifying realization. This melody was more than just a composition. It was a seal binding the dead and the living in one eternal song. Every finished note brought pain. Madison watched as the shadows of the musicians grew more real, inching closer to her. They circled the piano, their hands trembling, their faces contorted with torment. Madison knew they wanted completion, the end of their death, the end of their eternal suffering. But now she herself was becoming part of this symphony. Madison felt her mind crack under the pressure of the sounds. The shadows of the musicians were no longer just ghosts. They were living memories of the massacre, and she was the new victim. The score continued to unfold before her, and with it came the realization every note played was a step toward her own demise. The music was not just echoing in the hall, It was pulsing through her veins, draining her life with each measure. Madison tried to stop, but she couldn't. The notes were no longer under her control. She felt her fingers seem to draw out the final chords on their own, and each movement burned her with pain. The conductor standing before the orchestra raised his hand, and Madison understood this was her finale. One more beat, and she would be trapped in this school forever, sealed within the endless symphony of death. Madison's hands trembled as she reached the final pages of the score. The notes blurred before her eyes, as if bloody fingerprints had smeared every line. She heard the shadows whispering behind her, the voices of the musicians merging into a ghastly chorus, pleading and threatening all at once. They surrounded her, their distorted faces frozen in expressions of eternal pain, and their eyes, dark voids reflecting nothing but madness. She tried to focus, but her mind cracked under the strain. With each new note, she felt the last shreds of her will slipping away, dissolving into the echoing sound of the piano. The ghosts circled closer, reaching out with their pale, twisted hands, whispering words that gnawed at her from within. They wanted her to finish the symphony, to make her blood the final sacrifice sealing the curse. Tears streamed down Madison's face as she began to play the last chords. Each keystroke made the walls around her seem to close in, trapping her like a vice. The music grew louder, a deafening roar filling her ears. She watched as the shadows moved closer, their fingers brushing her shoulders, as if pulling her into the world of the dead. But the most terrifying thing was this: Madison realized her own hands were no longer hers. Her heart pounded wildly as she reached the final chord. Her consciousness wavered like shattering glass. The last note hung in the air, tearing through the silence of the hall. The ghosts surrounded her, their eyes glowing with malicious triumph, and from their open mouths came whispers demanding an end. Madison knew that after this, she would never leave. This symphony would be her curse, her prison, her end. Suddenly, after the final chord sounded, Madison, feeling the brief freedom of movement, sprang up and, consumed by terror, grabbed the scores. Her fingers clutched the pages that seemed to pulse in her hands like living things. She rushed to the fireplace, her trembling hands kindling a flame. But even as the paper crackled and blackened, the music did not stop. It played on in her head, like a mad voice forcing her to hear the dying screams over and over again. The fire roared, and the scores hissed, but Madison felt no relief. The symphony echoed in her ears, and her body began to twitch like a puppet on strings. She heard the conductor behind her, his steps thundering, and a cold, icy wind wrapped around her neck. Madison turned to confront him, but instead of Barlow, whom she had believed to be the conductor all along, she saw her own reflection, distorted by pain and fear. She understood. The music was now part of her, and even destroying the notes could not free her from the curse. The ghosts surrounded her one last time, bowing as if before their new conductor. Madison felt her hands rise, as if controlled by invisible threads, and her body took its place at the conductor's stand. The hall filled with shadows, but now they followed her movements, puppets in the hands of their new master. Madison waved her hand and the ghosts came to life, beginning to perform their dark symphony. Now she was their ruler, their eternal conductor. The sound of the music filled her mind, becoming her own blood, her new heartbeat. Each motion of the baton tore at her soul, but she could no longer stop. She was trapped in this sinister symphony, and the school became her eternal home. Outside, silence fell. The walls of the hall no longer let the sound escape, but inside the symphony played on. And Madison, once alive and full of hope, was now just a shadow bound to this place forever. The sounds of her music would echo within the school's walls for all eternity, a reminder of those who dared to touch the final chord of the cursed conductor.